Yo, 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 what up, my Mestizo Coffee Click? We're back in effect. You already know we got the great background. That means we're doing something new, something different, something fresh, something live. And that includes bringing on a guest to flex. Earlier this week, I had kind of the impulse to kind of fuck somebody up and punch them in the face. And upon reflection, it got me thinking about that sweet science, that poetry that is pugilism, boxing, and the connection that Mexican Americans have to the sport. So I thought I'd invite an expert on, Roberto Andrade Franco, to discuss boxing in the Mexican American experience. First things first, Roberto, how do you introduce yourself, bro? I'm Carlos most of the time.
Yeah, Roberto's fine.
No, but how do you operate in the world, like in class or like at work, or what's the story, bro?
You know what? Since I work from home, I hardly ever hear anything other than daddy. So
Is that right?
Yeah, that's it.
Now, how about coming up in high school and in college? They're calling you Robert. They're calling you Bobby.
No, I was always actually. So my parents are from Juarez, and we didn't move to deeper in the United States until I was like in third or fourth grade. I get to school, third or fourth grade. The teacher. So I knew a little bit of English before, so they put me in the split ESL regular class. The teacher, the white teacher, says she can't pronounce my name, so I'm like, so she gives me options. She's like, you could be called Bobby, you could be called Robert, you could be called Bob. And I hear Bobby, and I immediately was like, man, that sounds exotic. I'll fucking go by Bobby. So I get some type of like award for like showing up or AB honor or something, and they put Bobby on it. I showed it to my dad. I was like in second, third grade, and he goes, who the fuck is Bobby? Right. So short-lived. Yeah, short-lived. After that, I mean, I've always been with Roberto pretty much.
That's what's up. Nah, I've been Carlos. I always knew that if I told someone my name and we hadn't met, or if it became even the typical case of a name coming across on an application or resume, Carlos was a fuck up name. It was like Carlos was spell trouble. Carlos was a clown. And I did my best to kind of live up to that. So here we are. Now I brought you on because you have a really interesting connection to boxing and history. Not necessarily the history of boxing, but but talk about how boxing and history kind of play a role in what you study and think about and write about.
Well, I did a PhD at here in Dallas at SMU, and one of the things that after trying to find something to write about, I landed on boxing. One of my advisors said I should write it, even though I had never really considered it, just because it didn't seem academic, for lack of a better phrase, thing to do. Once I started doing it, I mean, boxing's always been a part of my life. It was always, some of my great life-changing, shaping memories revolve around boxing. One of them was like when Chávez fights De La Hoya the first time, right? And since I'm right there from the border, from El Paso and Juarez, it was the way that fight was discussed. There was a lot of things that I think a lot of Mexican Americans could relate to, right? That Chávez was this epitome of Mexico and Mexican and machismo, and De La Hoya was more a pocho, right? That because he plays golf, he somehow is less Mexican than Chávez. So that's what I started investigating. That's what I started writing about. Started focusing on that, and I found a lot of interesting connections with how boxing shapes Mexican and Mexican American culture, specifically working class culture.
That's right. And you mentioned two figures, and I thought maybe today we discuss what seem to be kind of three prominent figures in Mexican American boxing, and that is Julio César Chávez, Oscar de la Hoya, and we'll even add Ryan Garcia to this conversation. But and again, like your kind of investigation and your work isn't necessarily tracing the history of boxing, although it might involve some of that. It involves making connections between themes and boxing, and why should we expect boxing to bear out some of these themes? What happens? What is it about boxing as a sport?
Well, I think boxing, more than the most popular sport in Mexico is soccer. But boxing, I think, represents much more of a a stereotype of a even myth making that comes involved. I mean, you see some of that here in the United States as well, with what certain boxers represent at certain times. You know, Jack Johnson, Muhammad Ali, Mike Tyson, for better or worse. And it's just one of those things, at least the way I see it, that reflects a broader thing of culture, right? Specifically, once again, working class Mexican and Mexican American culture, that Chavez represents this macho, right? This epitome of Mexican manhood to a certain extent that others don't, right? And that at least me specifically growing up with this, it was that was like one of the heroes that I saw my dad have, right? That Chavez was a hero, and you know, my dad was very much a typical, you know, stoic Mexican type of thing, where you never saw him cry, and if you did, it was like, oh shit, something's fucked up if you saw him cry. And Chavez, that's what he was, that's what he represented, and I hadn't put this together up until once I started researching this, that I started kind of questioning my own beliefs, right? Of what Chavez meant to me, and what he meant to others, and why. And the more I talked about it, I mean, there's a lot of people who aren't boxing fans necessarily to the point that they're hardcore fans, that they know every single boxer, but more often than not, I found that they have some type of story that has to do about Chavez and De La Hoya, you know, these boxers that mean something.
Sure. I mean, if we were to, I mean, it's each of these, you know, Chavez and De La Hoya, and not maybe Garcia, but they have their story careers, and it's going to be impossible to kind of to unpack it, you know, much of that. But if we're just to focus in on Chavez, and what people often say about him is that he was a face-forward fighter and he could take a punch, which
Right.
we then took that as a kind of a badge of honor. But what are some ways in which maybe that idea, A, wasn't true, and B, maybe worked to our detriment in the long run?
Well, for the most part, it's true, but I think what happens with that is an underrated aspect of that is how intelligent of a fighter he was, and how, you know, you see some of this, and he was a lot more defensive minded than what we give him credit for. But all of that is just, I mean, every once in a while you still hear people talking about it, the whole Mexican style of boxing, which is basically just fighting, right? A bravado, huevos, right? As for lack of a better phrase, I mean, huevos encapsulates everything that you want to talk about. A machismo, that the way he fought was just like this vicious, reckless. Like I said, reckless is too much of a. It's a little too far, but you know, that's a stereotype. And I mean, for the most part, Chavez comes along in the 1980s. His career really takes off late 80s into a little part of the early 90s, and he's almost like the antithesis of how historically Mexicans have been portrayed, right? Where Mexicans, even going back all the way before the Braceros, but specifically with the Braceros, they were portrayed as these docile workers that would just put their head down. They wouldn't unionize. They wouldn't fight for their rights. They could survive off of beans and tortillas, and such, that they required little pay, you know, things like that. And Chavez comes along, and he's this great boxer for about, I don't know, 4 or 5 years. He's arguably the best boxer in the world. And that just coincides with Mexican migration coming towards increasing the United States, and also all the second and third and fourth generation Mexican Americans that are coming up. And Chavez becomes this symbol of so much more than just a boxer, right? In Mexico, he's still a national hero among some Mexican Americans here. You know, he's still a hero. I go to these boxing events often, and if Chavez is there, he'll draw bigger crowds than the main event boxers that are on the crowd, that are in the card. I mean, so Chavez means a lot symbolically.
And so Chavez doesn't speak any English, is that right? He's Spanish.
That's right. Only. That was one of his I guess one of his supposed markers of authenticity, right? That he never sold out, that he never spoke English, or that he was always just entirely Mexican. That was it.
And so then you'd have the next in line, Oscar De La Hoya. How is he different? How is he the same? How is he different? And how does he represent kind of the shift that's happening in Mexican American experience, in the Mexican American experience?
So Chavez and De La Hoya are separated by about 10 years, I would say. So De La Hoya, while Chavez is born in he grows up in Culiacan, right? That's another part of his supposed authenticity, that he's friends with all of these, what we know now as drug dealers, right? A lot of, if you're watching Narcos, a lot of those people were Chavez's friends. Maybe not friends, but they grew up together. And De La Hoya is born in L.A. De La Hoya is born in L.A. He's the son of Mexican immigrants. He's basically the first, second generation of Mexican Americans. De La Hoya fights in the Olympics for the United States, and he's considered this golden boy, right? Which is a privilege that Chavez never had, so far as being the golden boy, whatever that means. I mean, it means a lot of things. That De La Hoya is good looking, attractive, that he's marketable, that he has a huge female fan base, something that Chavez didn't have. Most of Chavez's fans were just fucking bunch of Mexican guys, right? De La Hoya is he's a star, he's a celebrity, he's a pitchman. He comes along in the 90s, like I said, about a 10-year difference, and by this time there's this whole, at least from the corporation standpoint, there's this whole, like, we need to tap into the Latino market, right? And who's better than De La Hoya, this golden boy image? And that's who he is. And he, unlike Chavez, he's much more of a boxer, right? There's a difference between boxer and brawler. And if you had to categorize the two, Chavez is a brawler, once again, like you point out, just coming reckless, and just huevos, right? That's what classifies him. And a boxer is much more intelligent, right? The game is to be hit and not be hit, right? The game is to hit and not be hit. And that was definitely De La Hoya, that he's not into these, stand in the middle of the ring and just pound away at each other until someone gets knocked the fuck out. He's more like, I'm going to hit you, just a classic boxer, much more than Chavez. So with that was much more of a marker of him not being Mexican enough, that he was assimilated, that he was a pocho, for lack of a better, or not even a lack of a better word. That's what it was, right? He's a pocho, that whatever that encompasses, it means a lot of different things. That's what he was, and that's what his style of fighting reflected, according to his detractors. And also the money. He makes a lot more money than Chavez, in large part because he's much more marketable than Chavez.
And famously, the script couldn't have been written any better. These two archetypes actually end up clashing in the ring. Is that right? And when did that happen, and what happened?
They fight July 7th, 1996, right? This is what I was mentioning earlier about one of my pivotal early life moments is watching Chavez versus De La Hoya in some trailer home on El Paso, and my cousins, my family, right? And I was going for Chavez, man. I was going for Chavez, even though culturally I had much more in common with De La Hoya. But at this point, like I said, this isn't until later that I start like, why did I hate De La Hoya so much, right? It was later on. And De La Hoya just beat the shit out of him. There's still some controversy whether Chavez came into the fight. According to him, he came into the fight cut, and De La Hoya opened up that cut, and they had to stop the fight in the fourth round, I believe. Excuse me, because he was a bloody mess. And that was one of those moments in my life that everybody in that trailer home, everybody who was a male, was going for Chavez, and everybody who was every woman in my family was going for De La Hoya. And that was one of those moments that just kind of like stayed with me. And I mean, it's been almost 28, 30 years now, and that's one of those moments that I still remember exactly where we were. I remember how hot it fucking was that day, all that shit.
Wait, so why do you think you hated De La Hoya then?
I think because of my father was such a Chavez fan, and everybody kind of his age were such Chavez fans, and in El Paso, it's much more influenced culturally from Mexico than it is from Texas. That it just felt like Chavez was one of us, right? And I say us because I'm considering myself much more Mexican than Mexican American. And once I moved away, I think also this had something to do with me moving away from the border and realizing the difference between Mexican Americans and Mexicans and Chicanos and Hispanics, Latinos. All these little things mean something different politically. It wasn't until that I started realizing. But I mean, to answer your question, simply as a 15-year-old watching, it was because Chavez was much more of a man, I guess, at that point than De La Hoya was. He was somebody who I wanted to be like much more than De La Hoya. Plus, also, you see yourself as like, man, I'm not going to grow up to be a fucking model like De La Hoya or whatever he is, So there was something much more. I could connect better with Chavez, right? Even though he was Mexican and I was Mexican American, I could relate much more to him coming up and being basically fighting his way up, starting these fights, starting his career and getting paid something like $20 a fight, Whereas De La Hoya, at least the way I saw it, he had a lot of advantages. He didn't. I mean, it's hard to say he had everything given to him because this is still the fighting game, and it's hard to say that about somebody who's making their living fighting. But he definitely had a lot more opportunities than Chavez, and I mean, I related to Chavez much more.
Then what does Ryan Garcia represent then? This internet sensation. Went viral before he became a champ.
Right.
Made millions even before becoming a champ.
I think Garcia at this point is he's I mean, I'm not sure. I know his parents. I'm not sure his parents are Mexicans. I'm not sure if they're Mexican American. I don't think they're Mexican immigrants. Garcia doesn't speak Spanish, which I mean doesn't necessarily disqualify you for anything of so far as identity, but I mean, I don't know. I have trouble with Ryan Garcia besides saying that and noting that he's kind of like this evolution of what Chavez, what De La Hoya is, what he is now, in part because I mean, I'm so much older than him that it's kind of hard to relate overall, right? But I mean, his appeal is obvious, right? He's got millions of followers. He's much more in the type of De La Hoya, right? That he's this good-looking guy that seems to have a lot of marketing potential. He's definitely talented. I don't think he's nearly as talented as De La Hoya, but also, if he's matched properly, then he's probably going to get a good jump start on his career so far as being a undefeated boxer for a while. And I mean, we'll see what he does.
Yeah, I wonder when corporate America, insofar as some brands make the mistake of reducing who this demo is to a singular type, right. If they assume it's Chavez, if they assume it's De La Hoya, if they assume it's Chavez, the immigrant kind of narrative, if they assume it's De La Hoya, this bicultural narrative where speak Spanish at home but English in school or at work, right. And then Garcia, this other kind of model where it's all English, defying convention, not only in the sport but in media and brand deals. So I wondered like who they think about, who they ought to be thinking about if they're smart. And I think we'll watch. I'll be watching Ryan Garcia.
Yeah, well, I mean, overall, I mean, you have to appeal to the broadest base that possible, right? And that's just basic. That's just basic business. I feel like. I mean, I've never taken a class, but it seems like if you appeal to all of these outs, because the boxing fans really are a small subgroup, a very weird, even subculture of society, and it expands a little bit more with De La Hoya, and perhaps it's going to expand a lot more than that, even with Garcia here.
All right, so who do you watch for? You watch for new Mexican boxers, new Mexican American boxers? Like, what do you have? What's going on with our heavyweight? What's going on with our heavyweight contender?
With Andy Ruiz, I mean, he seems to he's training under Canelo's trainer Eddie Reynoso. He seems like he's kind of regained his motivation, but I mean, he hasn't fought in more than a year now. So I mean, hopefully he comes back. I think the top Mexican boxer or Mexican American boxer right now will probably have to be Virgil Ortiz Jr. So I would say keep an eye out on him. He's a 147 pounder. He's probably gonna, he's like 21, 22 years old. He's got potential to be great. So I would say that's the one to look out for.
Thanks again for joining us. And as with always,